The rain had not yet come, but the sky over Thornfield village hung low and bruised, the colour of an old wound, and the air smelled of dust and dread. Eleanor Ashwood stood at the edge of the market square with a basket of mending pressed hard against her hip, and she knew, the way one knows a storm before it breaks, that something terrible was about to happen. The crowd had gathered around the well like a living thing, restless and hungry, and at its centre, pressed against the stone lip of the well with her hands raised in useless surrender, stood a servant girl, no older than 15. Her cap had slipped from her hair. Her apron was torn at the shoulder. Someone had already thrown something at her, an apple core perhaps, or a stone wrapped in spite, and it had left a mark of dirt across her cheek that made her look, for one unbearable moment, like a child who had fallen and had no mother to run to. "Thief," a man's voice called out, thick with drink and self-righteousness. "She took bread from the baker's window in broad daylight, and she'll answer for it." "I did not," the girl sobbed, but her voice broke apart before she could finish, swallowed by the growing murmur of the crowd, who had already decided her guilt the way crowds always do, quickly and without mercy, because mercy takes more effort than judgment. Eleanor felt her heart lurch. She did not know the girl's name. She did not know if the accusation was true, but she knew fear when she saw it, because she had worn that same fear on her own face more times than she cared to remember, in rooms far grander than this market square, at the mercy of people far better dressed than this mob. She did not decide to move. Her feet decided for her. By the time her mind caught up with her body, she was already standing between the girl and the crowd, her basket dropped forgotten at her feet, her chin lifted in the particular manner of a woman who has nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. "Enough," she said, and though her voice trembled at the edges, it carried. "Enough of this. Has anyone here seen her take anything, or are you simply enjoying the sound of your own cruelty?" A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. A gentleman near the front, for gentleman he clearly believed himself to be, in his fine but unremarkable brown coat, took a step forward, his face darkening. "Stand aside, miss. This is no business of a stranger's." "It is the business of anyone with a conscience," Eleanor said, and she did not move. What she could not have known, what no one in that square could have known, because he had made very certain of it, was that the man watching from beneath the shadow of the old chestnut tree at the edge of the square, dressed in the plain, unremarkable clothes of a land agent, his hat pulled low against the grey afternoon light, was not a stranger to power at all. He was Julian Vale, the Earl of Ashcombe, and he had come to Thornfield to see, with his own eyes, and without the courtesy of his title announced before him, what manner of people lived upon the land he had so recently and so unwillingly inherited. He had expected indifference. He had expected, if he were honest with himself, very little at all, a village like any other, tenants like any other, small dramas that meant nothing beyond their own narrow borders. He had not expected this. He had not expected a woman with a mended hem and work-roughened hands to plant herself between an angry crowd and a frightened child, as though the outcome of the world depended upon it. He watched her without moving, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression giving away nothing, though something in his chest had gone very still and very alert, the way a man's senses sharpen when he witnesses something he does not yet have words for. "She's a Rutherford servant," someone shouted from the back, as though that settled the matter, as though a girl's worth could be measured entirely by the house that employed her. "Not our concern if she starves for her thieving." "She is a child," Eleanor said, "and if bread was taken from a window, then let the baker say so himself, plainly, and let there be a magistrate to hear it, rather than a square full of people who have already tried and convicted her before their supper grows cold." The gentleman in the brown coat sneered. "And who are you to speak so boldly? Some upstart companion, I'd wager, playing at charity to feel important." Eleanor's cheeks burned, not from shame, but from the particular fury of being seen exactly as she feared she was seen, a woman without standing, without family influence, without the right, in the eyes of people like this, to have an opinion at all. She was the poor relation of Thornfield Hall, ward to her aunt by marriage, dependent on the goodwill of a household that reminded her daily, in 100 small and precise ways, that goodwill was not the same as belonging. But she did not step back. "I am no one of consequence," she said, and there was something in the plainness of the admission that silenced the nearest onlookers more thoroughly than any title could have. "I have no name here worth repeating, no fortune, no influence, nothing at all to protect me if you decide to turn your anger on me instead of her. But I will not stand by while a frightened child is made to answer for a crime no one troubled to prove. If you must have your victim today, then you may have me instead, for I promise you I will make a great deal more noise about it than she can." For one long, suspended moment, no one moved. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, an older woman, the baker's own wife as it happened, though Eleanor would not learn this until later, pushed her way forward, her face flushed with something that might have been shame. "The loaf fell," the woman said, loudly enough for all to hear. "I saw it myself." It rolled from the sill when the cart went by, and she picked it up from the mud, meaning only to return it, and someone shouted "thief" before she'd had the chance to explain herself, and the rest of you took up the cry like dogs after a fox, and never once asked what truly happened. The silence that followed was its own kind of verdict. The gentleman in the brown coat, robbed of his righteous fury, muttered something about wasted afternoons and turned away, and the crowd, as crowds do once their appetite has been denied, began to dissolve back into the ordinary business of the market, murmuring amongst themselves, already half ashamed, already half forgetting. Eleanor knelt beside the servant girl, whose name, she would soon learn, was Mercy, and helped her to her feet with hands that were gentler now than they had been fierce only moments before. "You're not hurt?" Eleanor asked. Mercy shook her head, though tears still streaked the dirt on her face. "No, miss, only frightened. I truly thought they meant to—" "I know," Eleanor said softly, "but it's over now. Come, I'll walk you back to the hall myself, and no one shall trouble you again today." She did not once look toward the chestnut tree at the edge of the square. She had no reason to. She did not know that a pair of grey eyes had watched her entire performance of quiet courage without blinking, had watched the way she had placed herself, without hesitation, between danger and a stranger who owed her nothing, had watched the particular dignity with which she had accepted the crowd's scorn rather than let it fall upon someone weaker. Julian Vale remained beneath the tree long after the square had emptied, turning the scene over in his mind the way a man turns over a coin whose value he has not yet determined. He had come to Thornfield wearing the plain coat of a land agent for a reason entirely separate from mercy or curiosity about servant girls. He had come because his cousin, the late Earl, had died leaving behind an estate riddled with debts no one in London seemed willing to discuss honestly, and a household of tenants and staff who had every reason to fear a new master they had never met. Julian had learned, through long and bitter experience, that people showed their truest selves only when they believed no one of consequence was watching. Lords saw performances. Agents, stewards, and strangers in plain coats saw the truth. He had meant to observe quietly for a fortnight, perhaps two, learn the character of his new household and his new neighbours, and then reveal himself when the truth could no longer be hidden behind curtsies and rehearsed courtesies. He had not planned on a woman who spoke to an angry crowd as though her own safety were the least interesting consideration in the world. He found himself, without quite deciding to, following at a discreet distance as she walked the servant girl back along the lane toward Thornfield Hall, his own house, though he had not yet set foot inside its front doors under his true name, and he watched the easy, unaffected kindness with which she spoke to the girl the entire way, asking after her family, her situation, whether she had eaten that day, as though the girl's welfare were a matter of genuine and ordinary concern, rather than an obligation to be performed and then forgotten. By the time the two women reached the gates of the hall and parted ways, Julian Vale, who had buried a great many soft instincts beneath years of duty, grief, and disappointment, found that something in his carefully guarded chest had shifted, quietly and without permission, into a shape he did not yet have a name for. He told himself it was merely curiosity. He was, within the week, to discover how thoroughly he had lied to himself. The following morning brought him, in his guise as Mr. Hale, the newly appointed land agent for the Ashcombe estate, into the drawing-room of Thornfield Hall itself, where he was received by Lady Prudence Rutherford, the late Earl's widowed sister-in-law, and Eleanor's aunt by a marriage that had ended in death and left behind more obligation than affection. Lady Prudence was a woman whose beauty had not entirely surrendered to age, though her expression carried the permanent, faint disapproval of someone who believed the world owed her better circumstances than it had delivered. She received Mr. Hale with the brisk civility one offers a useful servant, gestured him toward a chair he was not quite invited to sit in, and began at once to speak of tenant rents, drainage on the lower fields, and the deplorable state of the estate's finances, left behind by her late brother-in-law's mismanagement. Julian listened, made careful notes, and asked the sort of unassuming questions a land agent might reasonably ask, and it was in the answering of one such question, about household accounts, that Eleanor Ashwood entered the room, carrying a ledger she had clearly been asked to fetch, and stopped short at the sight of the stranger from the market square, seated near her aunt's chair. Recognition passed over her face, quick and startled, before she smoothed it away. "You," she said, before she could stop herself, and then flushed at her own forwardness. "Forgive me. I did not expect to see you again, sir." "Nor I you," Julian said, and something in his voice, low and even, carried more warmth than the words themselves accounted for. "Though I confess, I am glad of the chance to say that what I witnessed yesterday was among the bravest things I have seen in some time." Lady Prudence's eyebrows lifted with visible displeasure. "Eleanor, you did not mention you had made a spectacle of yourself in the village square." "I hardly thought it worth mentioning, Aunt," Eleanor said, setting the ledger down with careful precision. "A servant girl was wrongly accused. I would not have forgiven myself for staying silent." "You would do well," Lady Prudence said, in the tone of someone repeating a lesson for the 100th time, "to remember that a woman in your position cannot afford the luxury of drawing attention to herself, whatever the cause. Reputation is the only currency you possess, Eleanor, and you spend it far too freely." Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further, and Julian, watching this exchange with the careful stillness of a man cataloguing every detail, felt something harden quietly in his chest on her behalf. He recognized, with the particular clarity of someone who has endured his own version of it, the exhausting arithmetic of being tolerated rather than loved, of being useful rather than valued. He had grown up the second son of a minor branch of his family, never expected to inherit anything, raised in the shadow of a golden elder brother who had died young and left Julian, quite unexpectedly, heir to a title and an estate he had never wanted and did not entirely believe he deserved. He knew what it was to be measured constantly against an invisible standard set by someone else's expectations. He recognized that same weariness now, worn quietly beneath Eleanor Ashwood's composed exterior. "If I may," he said carefully, addressing Lady Prudence but watching Eleanor from the corner of his eye. "I understand the estate is in want of someone to assist with the household accounts and correspondence, given the recent upheaval in staff. Perhaps Miss Ashwood might be spared to assist me in reviewing the tenant records. Her knowledge of the local families would be invaluable, and it would relieve you of the burden." It was, he told himself, a reasonable and practical suggestion. It was also, quite plainly, an excuse to spend more time in her company, and some small, honest part of him knew it even as he spoke. Lady Prudence considered this with the calculating expression of a woman weighing convenience against propriety, and convenience, as it so often did in that household, won the argument. "Very well, Eleanor, you will assist Mr. Hale each morning until the accounts are set in order. See that it does not interfere with your other duties." And so began the strange, quiet unraveling of Julian Vale's carefully guarded heart. Over the following days, in the estate's dusty study, lined with ledgers and the smell of old paper and beeswax, Julian and Eleanor worked side by side, and he learned things about her that no title, no fortune, no polished London drawing room had ever taught him about a woman before. He learned that she had come to Thornfield at 12 years old, orphaned when her father, a country clergyman of modest means and considerable debts, had died suddenly, leaving her with no inheritance and no immediate family beyond a distant aunt who accepted her out of duty rather than affection. He learned that she had spent the better part of a decade making herself useful in every conceivable way, managing accounts, tending to sick tenants, teaching the younger servants their letters in stolen hours after her own work was done, not because anyone had asked it of her, but because she had learned early that usefulness was the only form of belonging she was likely to be offered. He learned that she read voraciously in the few hours she could claim as her own, and that her opinions on matters of philosophy and poetry were sharper and more considered than half the men he had debated at his club in London. He learned, most of all, that she laughed rarely, but when she did, over some small absurdity in an old account book or a story about one of the tenant children, it transformed her entire face into something so unguarded and lovely that he found himself, more than once, forgetting entirely what he had meant to say next. "You are very quiet this morning, Mr. Hale," she observed one grey Tuesday, some 2 weeks into their acquaintance, as she copied figures into a fresh ledger with a neat, economical hand. "Have I said something to offend you?" "Not at all," Julian said. "I was only thinking that you deserve a great deal more than this room allows you." Eleanor's pen paused. She glanced up at him with an expression he could not quite read. Surprise, certainly, but something wearier beneath it. "That is a kind thing to say, but kindness changes very little, Mr. Hale. I have long since made peace with what I am owed in this life, and what I am not." "And what is that?" "I am owed nothing," she said simply, without self-pity, as though stating a fact of weather or geography. "I am a poor relation in a house that tolerates me. I have no dowry, no connections worth speaking of, and a reputation my aunt reminds me daily is my only asset, which I am apparently forever on the verge of squandering. I do not say this to invite your pity. I say it because I find it easier to know precisely where I stand than to hope for something else and be disappointed." Something in Julian's chest ached at the quiet resignation in her voice, not because he pitied her, but because he recognized, with painful clarity, how thoroughly the world had trained her to expect so little of it, when he had watched with his own eyes how much courage and warmth and quiet fire lived inside her. "I do not think," he said carefully, "that you know your own worth at all, Miss Ashwood. And you, Mr. Hale, know a great deal about worth, do you, for a land agent?" she asked, though there was no unkindness in it, only genuine curiosity, and something that might almost have been teasing. It was a question that landed closer to the truth than she knew, and Julian felt the familiar cold weight of his deception settle more heavily upon him than it had in days. He had told himself, when he first arrived in Thornfield under a false name, that the disguise was a matter of practical necessity, a way to observe his new responsibilities honestly, without the distorting effect of his title. He had told himself that he would reveal the truth within a fortnight, that no real harm could come from a small, temporary deception among strangers whose good opinion did not matter to him. He had not accounted for the possibility that one of those strangers would come to matter to him more than almost anyone he had ever known. Each day that passed without confession became a day harder to undo. Each conversation, each small, unguarded laugh, each moment of quiet trust extended toward Mr. Hale, the land agent, was, he knew with growing unease, being extended under false pretenses, and the longer it continued, the more certain he became that when the truth finally emerged, it would not be received as a harmless oversight, but as a betrayal. He told himself he would confess soon, tomorrow perhaps, or the day after. He did not yet understand how much more complicated tomorrow was about to become. The complication arrived, as complications so often do, in the form of a carriage bearing the Ashcombe crest, and a letter that Lady Prudence received one bright afternoon with an expression of undisguised delight that Eleanor had rarely seen upon her aunt's face. "The Earl himself is to visit within the fortnight," Lady Prudence announced at dinner that evening, practically glowing with the news. "Lord Ashcombe has written to say he intends to inspect the estate personally before the harvest season, and has requested lodging here at the Hall rather than at the dower house in the village. Can you imagine the honour? An earl dining beneath our own roof." Eleanor felt very little at the announcement, beyond a mild, distant curiosity about what manner of man had inherited an estate he had apparently shown so little interest in until now. She had heard the servants gossip about the new earl, a reclusive figure, they said, unmarried, said to have grown cold and guarded since the death of his elder brother years before, a man of business and duty rather than pleasure, who had not been seen in society for the better part of 2 years. She thought nothing more of it until she noticed, the following morning, that Mr. Hale had gone strangely quiet over the household ledgers, his composure carrying an edge of tension she had not seen in him before. "You seem troubled, Mr. Hale," she observed. "I have a great deal of work to complete before Lord Ashcombe arrives," he said, which was, in its way, entirely true, though not remotely the whole of it. What he did not say, what he could not yet bring himself to say, was that there would be no earl arriving in a grand carriage to inspect the estate for the first time, because the earl had already been here, for nearly a month, sitting across from her at this very table, learning her heart in 100 small, quiet moments while she believed herself safe in the company of an ordinary man. He understood, with a dread that settled cold and heavy in his stomach, that he had trapped himself. To continue the deception now would be to deceive her far more grievously than he had ever intended. To reveal the truth suddenly, without preparation, risked destroying whatever fragile trust had grown between them, and risked her believing, not unreasonably, that his interest in her had been some manner of cruel amusement, a lord's idle game, played at the expense of a woman with nothing to protect herself from the consequences. He resolved, that night, to tell her the truth before the household could learn it any other way. He was not given the chance. The following afternoon, a second letter arrived, this one addressed not to Lady Prudence but to the entire household, announcing that Lord Ashcombe's arrival had been moved forward. He would arrive not in a fortnight, but within 3 days' time, accompanied by his London solicitor, and, to Lady Prudence's barely contained rapture, his aunt, the formidable Dowager Countess of Marsh, a woman whose approval was said to make or ruin marriages across half of England. 3 days, Lady Prudence breathed, already calculating menus and seating arrangements with the fervour of a general planning a campaign. "Eleanor, you will need a new gown. I will not have you embarrassing this household before the Dowager Countess." It was, in the strange arithmetic of Lady Prudence's affections, the closest thing to genuine care Eleanor had received from her aunt in years, not born of love, but of the practical fear that any visible poverty or plainness in her niece might reflect badly upon the household during so important a visit. Eleanor accepted the offer of a new gown with quiet gratitude nonetheless, too accustomed to disappointment to expect the sentiment behind it to run any deeper. She found Mr. Hale in the study that evening, later than usual, staring at a ledger he did not appear to be reading. "You've barely spoken all day," she said, settling into the chair across from him with the easy familiarity that had grown between them over the past weeks. "Is something wrong?" Julian looked up at her, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, his grey eyes carrying an intensity that made her breath catch unexpectedly in her throat. "Eleanor," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the formal address that propriety demanded, and the sound of it in his voice did something strange and unsteady to her heart. "There is something I must tell you, and I fear that once I have said it, you will not wish to look at me the same way again." Her stomach dropped. "You are frightening me, Mr. Hale." "That is not my intention." He set down his pen with careful deliberation, as though the small, ordinary motion might steady something larger inside him. I have not been entirely honest with you about who I am, and I find I can no longer bear the weight of that dishonesty, whatever it costs me to correct it. Before he could say another word, however, the study door opened, and Lady Prudence swept in, breathless with excitement, entirely unaware that she was interrupting the most important conversation of her niece's life. "Mr. Hale, there you are. I require your assistance at once regarding the guest arrangements for the Earl's visit, if you would be so good." Julian closed his eyes briefly, and Eleanor watched something like grim resolve settle across his features. "Of course, Lady Prudence," he said, rising. He glanced back at Eleanor as he reached the door, and the look he gave her was heavy with an apology she did not yet understand the shape of. "We will finish our conversation soon, Eleanor. I promise you that." He did not know, as he left the room that evening, that soon would not come soon enough. The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation, and Julian found himself, cruelly, granted no further private moment with Eleanor at all. Lady Prudence kept him occupied from dawn until well past dark with the frantic logistics of hosting an earl, and Eleanor herself was swept into the equally frantic business of gowns, guest lists, and household inspections, until the two of them passed each other only in hurried corridors, exchanging glances heavy with things unsaid. By the time the third day arrived, the day of the Earl's official arrival, Julian understood, with a sinking, helpless dread, that he had run entirely out of time to explain himself gently. He would have to do it publicly now, in front of the household, in front of Lady Prudence and the Dowager Countess, and God knew who else, and there would be no soft unveiling of the truth, no careful preparation of her heart before the blow landed. There would only be the moment itself, the moment when Eleanor Ashwood looked up and realized that the man she had come to trust, perhaps even to love, had been lying to her from the very first day they met. The carriages arrived at 4 in the afternoon, in a light drizzle that seemed, to Julian, entirely appropriate to his mood. He watched from an upstairs window as the household assembled in the drive to receive them. Lady Prudence resplendent in her best silk, the staff arranged in careful rows, and Eleanor standing slightly apart, in a new gown of soft grey blue that suited her far better than she seemed to realize, her hands clasped nervously before her. He took a breath, straightened his coat, no longer the plain brown wool of Mr. Hale, but the dark, finely tailored coat that belonged to the Earl of Ashcombe, and descended the stairs to meet his own household as himself, for the first time. The gasp that rippled through the assembled staff when he stepped through the front doors was audible even from the drive. "Lord Ashcombe," Lady Prudence breathed, her face draining of colour as understanding dawned. "But you are Mr. Hale." "Yes," Julian said quietly, unable to look anywhere but at Eleanor, whose face had gone perfectly, terribly still. All colour vanished from it, her eyes wide with a betrayal so raw and immediate that it struck him like a physical blow. "I owe you all a very great apology, and none more than Miss Ashwood." The silence that followed was the longest of his life. "You," Eleanor's voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, but it carried the particular devastation of someone whose entire understanding of the past month had just shattered beneath her feet. "You let me believe, all this time, you let me believe you were... Eleanor, please, let me explain." "Do not," she said, and though her voice trembled, there was iron beneath it, the same iron he had first seen in the market square, standing between a mob and a frightened child. "Do not call me by my given name, my lord, as though we are still what I believed us to be this morning." She turned, with the same quiet dignity that had first drawn him to her, and walked back into the house without another word, leaving Julian standing in the rain, with his household staring at him, and the wreckage of his deception scattered visibly across every face present. The days that followed were, for Julian, among the most miserable of his life, and he had known genuine grief before: the loss of his brother, the cold distance of a father who had never quite forgiven him for outliving his more beloved son. But this particular misery was sharper, because it was entirely his own doing, built brick by brick from his own cowardice in delaying a truth he should have told her weeks before. Eleanor did not appear at dinner. She did not appear in the study, where the ledgers sat untouched and gathering the particular dust of abandoned intentions. When their paths crossed in the corridors, she offered him the same cool, correct courtesy she might have offered any stranger of rank, and nothing more. No warmth, no teasing, no unguarded laughter, as though the woman he had come to know over the past month had vanished entirely, replaced by a careful, distant stranger. The Dowager Countess of Marsh, a sharp-eyed woman who missed very little, observed this frozen tension over the course of a single dinner and drew Julian aside afterward with the directness of a woman who had long ago stopped concerning herself with delicacy. "You are in love with that girl," she said, without preamble, once they were alone in the library. Julian did not bother denying it. "It hardly matters now, Aunt. I have ruined whatever chance I might have had." "Nonsense," the Dowager said crisply. "You have made a fool's mistake, which is not the same as an unforgivable one. The question is not whether you deceived her, Julian. The question is why, and whether you have the courage to make her understand it properly, rather than sulking about the house like a wounded dog, waiting to be forgiven without effort." "I did not deceive her out of cruelty. I did not imagine you had," the Dowager said, more gently now. "But intention matters very little to a woman who has spent her life being underestimated and overlooked, and who now believes the one person who seemed to see her clearly did so only as part of some elaborate performance. If you wish to win her trust back, Julian, you will have to prove it, not simply explain it. Words are cheap. She has likely heard a great many pretty words in her life that meant nothing at all." Julian turned the Dowager's words over for a long while after she had retired, and understood, slowly, that she was right. An apology alone would not undo what had been broken. He would have to show Eleanor in some undeniable way that his affection had never been a game, that the man she had known as Mr. Hale and the Earl standing before her now were, in every way that mattered, precisely the same person, and that his feelings for her had grown from truth, not deception. The opportunity, when it came, arrived from an unexpected direction entirely. It began with whispers among the tenants, troubling rumors that reached Julian's ears through his steward, concerning debts left behind by the previous Earl that had been quietly, dishonestly transferred onto the accounts of several tenant families, including, it emerged with a cold and specific horror, the family of young Mercy, the servant girl Eleanor had defended in the market square weeks before. Mercy's father, a tenant farmer named Josiah Dunn, had fallen gravely behind on payments he did not in fact owe, payments that had been fraudulently recorded against his name by a corrupt former estate manager who had absconded with the difference before the old Earl's death, leaving the debt, through careless or deliberate bookkeeping, attached to Dunn's name instead of the thief's. Lady Prudence, upon learning of the discrepancy, urged Julian to handle the matter quietly and privately, in the manner such things were traditionally handled, a discreet correction in the ledgers, no public acknowledgement of the previous mismanagement, nothing that might embarrass the family name or invite scrutiny of the estate's affairs. Julian, however, found himself thinking of a woman standing alone against an angry crowd in defense of a servant girl who owed her nothing, refusing to let injustice pass unspoken merely because silence was more convenient. He called a public gathering of the tenants in the village square, the very same square where Eleanor had first defended Mercy, and there, before the assembled families of Thornfield, he corrected the record aloud, named the fraud for what it was, forgave the fraudulent debt entirely, and announced, further, that any tenant family who had suffered similar mismanagement under the previous administration would have their accounts reviewed and corrected without exception. It was not, strictly speaking, a gesture aimed at winning back Eleanor's affection. It was simply the right thing to do, and Julian had learned, over the past month in her company, to care rather more about doing the right thing than he had before he met her. But Eleanor, who had come to the village that day on an errand for her aunt, and found herself, quite by accident, standing at the edge of the crowd as Julian spoke, felt something in her carefully guarded heart begin, despite her every effort to prevent it, to soften. She watched him speak to Josiah Dunn directly, with none of the practiced condescension she had seen in other men of rank when addressing tenants, but with a plain, respectful sincerity that reminded her powerfully of the man she had known as Mr. Hale. She watched him kneel, briefly, to speak with Mercy herself, apologizing for the fear the fraudulent debt had caused her family, and she saw, unmistakably, that this was not performance. This was simply who he was, whether he wore the plain coat of a land agent or the fine tailoring of an earl. She did not approach him that day. Her wound was still too raw, her trust too recently broken, for forgiveness to arrive so quickly. But something had shifted, quietly, in the careful arithmetic of her heart, and Julian, watching her from across the square, saw it too, saw the way her expression had softened, even briefly, before she turned and walked away. It was not everything, but it was, he allowed himself to hope, a beginning. That fragile hope was tested sooner than either of them expected, and from a direction Eleanor had not thought to guard against. Word of the new Earl's unmarried state had of course travelled swiftly beyond the borders of Thornfield, and within a fortnight of the fraud's public correction, a Miss Cordelia Whitfield arrived at the hall in a carriage far too fine for the modest country roads, accompanied by her mother and a great many trunks that suggested an intention to stay considerably longer than mere politeness required. Miss Whitfield was, by every conventional measure, exactly the sort of bride a man of Julian's rank was expected to choose. Beautiful in the fashionable manner, well-dowered, distantly connected to a duke, and possessed of a charm that revealed itself, on closer acquaintance, to be entirely a matter of practiced performance, rather than genuine warmth. Lord Ashcombe and I were introduced in London 2 seasons ago, Miss Whitfield informed the assembled household at dinner, with the easy confidence of a woman accustomed to being believed. My mother and his late brother's mother were the closest of friends, you understand, and there was always an understanding between our families that a match might one day be made. I confess I had begun to despair of him ever settling his affairs enough to think of marriage at all, but here I am, determined to remind him of what waits for him in town, whenever he tires of country ledgers. Eleanor said nothing throughout the meal, though she felt each word land with a small, precise sting, and could not help but notice how easily Lady Prudence brightened at the mere suggestion of such a connection, calculating, no doubt, the advantages a match between Ashcombe and the Whitfield fortune might bring to a household still recovering from years of financial mismanagement. Julian, for his part, treated Miss Whitfield with unfailing but entirely correct courtesy, the same courtesy he might extend to any guest beneath his roof, and made no effort whatsoever to encourage the connection she so plainly hoped to revive. But Eleanor, watching from her now familiar place at the edges of the household's grander gatherings, felt the old, exhausting doubt creep back in, regardless of Julian's evident indifference to their guest. She had spent too many years being reminded of exactly what she was not beautiful in the fashionable sense, not wealthy, not connected to dukes, to trust easily that such things did not, in the end, matter more than character. "You are avoiding me," Julian said, finding her alone in the walled garden one evening, several days into Miss Whitfield's visit, where Eleanor had retreated with a book she had not managed to read a single page of. "I am giving you space to entertain your guest properly," Eleanor said, with a lightness she did not entirely feel. "Miss Whitfield is not my guest, in any sense that matters to me," Julian said, settling onto the bench beside her without invitation. She arrived uninvited, hoping to revive an understanding that existed only in her mother's imagination, and I have told her as plainly as courtesy allows that I have no intention of encouraging it. I would tell her more plainly still, Eleanor, if I did not fear the scandal it would cause your aunt to endure a guest so publicly rebuffed beneath her own roof. And if she were connected to a duke, and beautiful, and entirely without the burden of scandal attached to her name?" Eleanor asked quietly, unable quite to keep the old wound from her voice. "Would that not be the sensible match for a man in your position?" "I have no dowry, Julian. I bring you nothing but complication." Julian turned to face her fully, and there was something fierce in his expression that she had not seen since the night of the fire. "You bring me honesty," he said, "which I have found, in my 30 years upon this earth, to be considerably rarer and more valuable than a dowry. I did not fall in love with a fortune, Eleanor, or a connection to a duke, or a woman skilled in the particular performance society expects of its brides. I fell in love with a woman who stood alone against a mob to defend a stranger, who ran into a burning house for a servant girl, who has never once, in the entire time I have known her, pretended to be anything other than exactly who she is. If that is complication, then I confess I have grown rather fond of it, and I find I have no appetite whatsoever for the simplicity Miss Whitfield offers instead." It was not, Eleanor would later admit, the doubt itself that Miss Whitfield's visit had planted in her that troubled her most, but how quickly and thoroughly Julian's answer had dissolved it. A lightness of heart she had not dared trust herself to feel so completely, not since long before her father's death had first taught her how quickly comfort could be taken away. Miss Whitfield departed within the week, her ambitions plainly unrewarded, though not before delivering one final, pointed remark to Eleanor in the privacy of the front hall, observing with a thin smile that a companion's fortunes could rise and fall a great deal faster than she might imagine, and that she would do well not to grow too attached to a position she had no true claim to. Eleanor, remembering the courage she had summoned in a market square weeks before, met the remark with a calm, steady dignity that left Miss Whitfield with nothing further to say, and watched her carriage depart down the drive without a flicker of the old insecurity Julian had so recently laid to rest. It was only a week after Miss Whitfield's departure, in the deep hours of a night that began ordinarily enough, that the true test of Julian and Eleanor's fragile new understanding arrived, not in the form of a rival or a doubt, but in the far more immediate and terrifying shape of fire. The fire broke out in the servants' quarters of Thornfield Hall in the deep hours of the night, sparked by a fallen candle in the laundry room, and spreading, with terrifying speed, through the dry timber of the older wing of the house. Eleanor woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of shouting, and her first thought, clear and instant, was of the younger servants who slept in the attic rooms above the laundry, including Mercy, whose bravery she had defended weeks before, and who now might be trapped above a fire with no one to remember her. She did not stop to think of her own safety. She ran toward the smoke, not away from it, taking the servants' stairs 2 at a time, despite the growing heat and the acrid burn of smoke in her lungs, and reached the attic corridor just as the flames began licking hungrily at the wooden banister below. She found Mercy and 2 younger housemaids huddled together in terror at the far end of the corridor, the main stairway already impassable behind a wall of smoke and flame. "There is a servant's ladder at the end of the east passage," Eleanor gasped, her eyes streaming from the smoke. "Follow me, quickly now, and do not look back." She led the 3 girls through the corridor with a calm she did not entirely feel, guiding them toward the narrow service ladder that led down to a rear courtyard, and had just begun helping the youngest girl over the ledge when a support beam somewhere above them gave way with a groan of splitting wood, and a section of ceiling collapsed directly behind them, cutting off their retreat and filling the passage with a choking wall of smoke and falling debris. It was Julian, roused by the shouting, already half-dressed and moving through the burning house with the same fearless determination he had once watched Eleanor show in a market square, who reached the collapsed section of corridor moments later, calling her name into the smoke with a desperation that stripped away every ounce of the careful composure he had maintained since the day his deception was revealed. "Eleanor, here!" Her voice, muffled and choking, came from beyond the fallen beam. "The girls are safe. They've gone down the ladder. But I cannot move the beam alone, Julian. I am trapped." He did not hesitate. He threw his weight against the fallen beam, heedless of the heat scorching his hands, heedless of anything at all except the sound of her voice on the other side of the smoke, and with a final, desperate effort, born of something far stronger than mere physical strength, he shifted the beam enough to pull her free, coughing and singed but alive, into his arms. They stumbled together down the service ladder and out into the cool night air, where the rest of the household stood watching the flames consume the old wing of the house, and Julian, still holding Eleanor against his chest, as though he could not quite bring himself to release her, felt something in his chest break open entirely. "You could have died," he said, his voice raw, his hands trembling now that the danger had passed and left only fear behind it. "You ran into a burning house for a servant girl you had known for less than a month." "As I recall," Eleanor said, her own voice unsteady, though a ghost of something like her old teasing had crept back into it, "you ran into the same burning house for me." "I would run into 100 burning houses for you," Julian said, and the words came out of him with none of the careful, measured control he usually applied to matters of the heart, raw and immediate and entirely honest. "Eleanor, I know I have given you every reason to doubt me. I know that what I did, the weeks of deception, however well I meant it at the start, was a betrayal of the trust you gave me so freely. But I have loved you, I think, since the moment I watched you stand alone between an angry crowd and a child who was not yours to protect, asking for nothing in return but that justice be done. Everything I have felt for you since has only confirmed what I understood in that first instant, that you are the bravest, most genuinely good person I have ever known, and that I would rather spend my life earning your forgiveness than spend it comfortable and untested in some marriage built on convenience and title alone." Eleanor stared up at him, smoke-stained and trembling, her heart aching with the particular pain of wanting desperately to believe something after having been so recently and thoroughly hurt. "You let me believe you were an ordinary man," she said quietly. "You let me speak to you freely, without the caution I would have shown an earl. You let me—" her voice caught. "You let me fall in love with a version of you I believed I understood completely, and then you took that understanding away from me in front of the entire household." "I know," Julian said, and there was no defense in his voice, only quiet, aching honesty. "And I will spend as long as it takes proving to you that the man you fell in love with was never a disguise, Eleanor. He was simply me, without the weight of a title standing between us. I did not become someone else the moment I put on that coat. I only became someone the world had not yet taught to distrust everything I said." The fire was brought fully under control before dawn, though the old wing of the house would require months of repair, and in the strange, exhausted quiet of the aftermath, Eleanor found herself unable to summon the anger that had sustained her over the past 2 weeks. What remained, instead, was something far more complicated. A tenderness she had tried desperately to bury, mingled with a caution she was not yet ready to release entirely. "I need time," she told him, as the sky began to lighten toward morning. "Not because I doubt what you feel, Julian, but because I have spent my entire life being underestimated, overlooked, and made to feel that my trust was worth very little to the people who asked for it. I will not hand mine over again so easily, even to a man I—" She stopped herself, unwilling yet to finish the sentence. "Even to a man you love," Julian finished softly, though he did not press her to confirm it. "Take whatever time you need, Eleanor. I have waited a great many years to feel what I feel for you. I can wait a little longer to deserve it properly." The weeks that followed brought a slow, careful rebuilding, not of the burned wing of Thornfield Hall alone, though that repair proceeded steadily under Julian's direct and personal attention, but of the fragile trust between two people who had each, in their own way, learned to expect very little tenderness from the world. Julian did not simply wait passively for Eleanor's forgiveness. He earned it, in 100 small, deliberate acts that asked nothing in return. He established a proper trust for the education of tenant children, insisting that Mercy and other servant children be given the chance to learn their letters formally rather than in stolen hours. He personally oversaw the correction of every fraudulent account left behind by the previous management, refusing Lady Prudence's repeated suggestions that such matters be handled quietly and without public acknowledgement. He spoke often and honestly with Eleanor, not of romance but of ordinary things, of tenant concerns and estate business, and the books she loved, treating her opinion with the same genuine respect he had shown her when he believed himself merely Mr. Hale, the land agent, with nothing but his character to recommend him. Lady Prudence, for her part, underwent a smaller but no less significant transformation of her own. Whether from genuine reflection or simple practical recognition of where the wind now blew, she began, gradually, to treat Eleanor with something closer to warmth than obligation, going so far one evening as to admit, quietly and only once, as though the words cost her a great effort, that she had perhaps been unfair in the years she had measured her niece's worth by how little trouble she caused rather than how much good she did. It was the Dowager Countess in the end who forced the final reckoning in her characteristically direct fashion some 6 weeks after the fire, at a small dinner held to celebrate the completion of the repairs to the old wing. "I have watched the two of you circle one another for 2 months now, like a pair of wary cats," the Dowager announced over dessert, to the visible mortification of nearly everyone present. "Julian, you have rebuilt half this estate and half your reputation trying to prove yourself worthy of this young woman's regard. Eleanor, you have forgiven him in every practical sense already, whatever caution you still pretend to. I am an old woman, and I have very little patience remaining for young people too proud to say plainly what they feel. Julian, take the girl into the garden and settle this matter before I die of old age, waiting for either of you to summon the courage." The laughter that followed broke the tension of the room, and Julian, catching Eleanor's eye across the table, saw in her expression something that was, for the first time in weeks, entirely unguarded: amusement, warmth, and something that looked very much like invitation. The garden at Thornfield, in the soft blue light of early evening, still carried the last warmth of the day, and Julian led Eleanor along the gravel path toward the old stone bench beneath the orangery windows, where they had once spent an entire afternoon, weeks before the truth had come between them, debating the merits of a novel she had lent him under an assumed name. "The Dowager Countess does not mince words," Eleanor said, a small, uncertain smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "No," Julian agreed, "she never has." He turned to face her fully, and though he had rehearsed 100 versions of this conversation in the quiet hours since the fire, every careful word deserted him now, leaving only the plain truth. "Eleanor, I do not wish to spend one more day pretending that I am simply your friend, or your landlord, or a man patiently waiting out your forgiveness at a respectful distance. I love you. I loved you before I knew what your love might cost me, and I have loved you more with every week that has passed since, watching you rebuild your trust in me, with the same quiet courage you showed a frightened servant girl in a market square. I am not asking you to forget what I did. I am asking whether you might, in time, be willing to build something new with me, something built on honesty, from this day forward, whatever title either of us carries." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, the evening light catching the unshed brightness in her eyes. "Do you know," she said finally, "what frightened me most when I learned the truth about who you were? It was not the deception itself, though that hurt a great deal. It was the fear that I had imagined the connection between us, that what I believed was genuine understanding had only ever been a performance you gave to observe your tenants more closely, and that the real Julian Vale, Earl of Ashcombe, would have nothing at all in common with the Mr. Hale I had come to trust." "And now?" Julian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Now," Eleanor said, "I have watched you these past 6 weeks, and I understand that I was wrong to fear that. You are precisely the same man, Julian, whether you wear a plain coat or a fine one. The kindness, the honesty, the way you looked at Mercy's father as though his dignity mattered as much as any lord's, none of that changed when your name did. I think," she added, and her voice grew softer still, I have loved you since the moment you shifted that beam with your bare hands, rather than lose another second reaching me. Perhaps longer, if I am honest with myself. Perhaps since a rainy afternoon in a study full of dusty ledgers, when a land agent I had known only a fortnight told me I deserved a great deal more than that room allowed me, and meant it. Julian reached for her hand, and this time she did not pull away. "Then let me spend the rest of my life proving I meant every word of it," he said. "Not as an earl offering charity to a poor relation, Eleanor, but as a man who has never in his life met anyone he respected more than you." Their wedding, when it came that autumn, was neither the grand society spectacle Lady Prudence had once dreamed of, for a niece married so far above her expected station, nor the quiet, apologetic affair Eleanor might once have imagined for herself, given how little she had been taught to expect from the world. It was instead something entirely their own, held in the very garden where he had finally spoken the truth of his heart, attended by tenant families whose debts he had forgiven, and whose children now learned their letters at the estate's expense, by servants who had once feared for their positions and now served a household that valued them, and by Mercy herself, now thriving under the protection of a family no longer burdened by a debt that had never truly belonged to them, who wept openly through the entire ceremony and declared, to anyone who would listen, that she had personally witnessed the whole story, from its very first, terrifying beginning in the village square. Lady Prudence, seated in the front row in her finest silk, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief and permitted herself, for perhaps the first time in Eleanor's memory, an expression of unguarded and entirely genuine pride. The Dowager Countess, watching from beside her, leaned over and murmured, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had correctly predicted an outcome from the very beginning, "I told him, you know. Take the girl into the garden and settle it. I do so enjoy being right." As for Julian and Eleanor themselves, standing together beneath the orangery windows as the autumn light turned gold around them, neither of them required grand speeches to understand what had brought them to this moment. It had begun, quite simply, with a woman who refused to let injustice pass unchallenged, and a man who had watched her do it from the shadows and understood, in that single unguarded instant, that he had finally found someone worth revealing his whole self to. Not the Earl, not the disguise, but the man beneath both, who had spent so long believing himself unworthy of being truly known, until Eleanor Ashwood taught him, without ever meaning to, that being truly known was the beginning of every kind of love worth having. They built in the years that followed precisely the life they had promised one another in that garden, one of honesty rather than performance, of quiet courage, rewarded rather than punished, of a household where kindness was not a weakness to be hidden, but a strength openly practiced, from the Earl and his Countess down to the newest servant girl learning her letters in the estate's small schoolroom. And though Eleanor Ashwood, Countess of Ashcombe, would in time become known throughout the county for her charitable works and her fierce, unwavering advocacy for the tenants and servants so many of her rank overlooked entirely, she never forgot, and never let her husband forget either, that it had all begun on a grey afternoon in a market square, when a frightened servant girl needed someone brave enough to stand between her and a mob, and a poor relation with nothing to protect her but her own conscience had decided that some things mattered more than her own safety. It was, she often said in later years, the truest measure of a person, not what they did when the world was watching, but what they did when they believed no one of consequence was watching at all. Julian, for his part, never forgot the shadow of the chestnut tree, or the woman who had taught him, without ever knowing it, exactly what kind of man he wished to become.